Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am finding the necessary screen because I'm one of these people with 7,000 tabs open at a time. I think I'm not the only one out there who has this particular issue. Here we are. The talk that you're about to watch is by Tori Potenza. It's called I Am She, The Witch Archetype and Patriarchal Disruption. We're very excited to have you here to give this talk at the Final Girls Brain Binge. Tori Potenza is a Philly-based historian whose focus has been on recontextualizing women's history. Her thesis focused on the history of women and mental health care in the United States. Through her writing as a film critic, she's written numerous pieces with feminist horror perspectives, including a series on female killers in films, themes of sex and gender in David Cronenberg films, and a piece on the witch as a feminist icon. She is currently a DEI professional, staff writer for MovieJawn.com, and she co-hosts the Killer Bees podcast. So thank you so much for being here with us, Tori, and I'm going to give the floor to you. Also, real quick, just to remind people, you can send your questions in the chat, and we will collect them and ask Tori after the talk. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I know a couple people in the crowd are here, like my Killer Bees partner and my dad. So glad to see you all here. And thank you, Final Girls, for having me. This is one of my favorite film festivals. And so it's kind of a dream to be a part of the Brain Bitch this weekend. So yeah, like they said, my name is Tori Potenza. I'm excited to bring this presentation to you all. This presentation evolved from a piece I wrote at my old publication, Cinema 76, which has since merged with MovieJawn a few years ago. The piece I wrote was called A Reclamation of Female Power, The Witch in Modern Cinema. Since then, I have thought more about the topic and tried to expand the scope of my research, and felt that while writing the piece, thinking about the witch type as specifically an archetype in film that offers a lot of empowerment to female identifying folks that are watching. So I think this specifically has become a trend in a lot of modern films. I'm sure there's a couple films that you all will know that I'll be talking about. Specifically, Eggers the Witch, I think, is a really good example of kind of the new trend in storytelling around the witch archetype. But as I did more and more research, I also noticed a lot of interesting trends throughout like film history, using the witch both as a way to empower women, but also as a specifically an enemy of the patriarchy in numerous ways, and kind of going after structures and systems that have been in place that have historically put women down. I know there's still plenty of films that I probably have not seen that might pertain to this research. So, you know, if people have suggestions, please throw them in the chat as well. I gained a lot of knowledge just from film friends of mine who've been able to kind of add to some of this research I've been doing. So I'd definitely be glad to hear from anyone else on things that pertain to this. Quick content warning, this will, not go into detail, but I will reference rape, assault, and different portrayals of violence against women. And then I think if you were in Taryn's talk a little while ago, she did a really great job of just highlighting that a lot of the films she covered are, mostly portraying like westernized culture, white women specifically in a lot of these films. There's still a lot of whitewashing. It's something I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my talk too, but it's something I wanted to bring up kind of going into this. So to begin, I just want to give some historical background for everyone, talking about the witch hunts and trials in general. So I'll be referring to the European and American witch hunts, since those, the films that I'm referencing mostly reference them and use them as for their storytelling purposes. This is a really condensed and broad explanation about the European witch hunts because they went on for a very long period of time across many different countries. And so those look different depending on what country and what time you were in. But when historians talk about the period of European witch hunts, they're typically talking about the time between beginning around the 1400s and it really becoming a major phenomenon around the 1560s. Although there were accusations and of witches before this. As far back as 1080 in Denmark, women were blamed for bad weather and epidemics that were happening at the time. And then even as late as the 18th century, there are records of executions for witchcraft. 3/4 of the European witch hunts occurred in Western Germany, the Lower Countries, France, Northern Italy, and Switzerland areas. There's also a lot of persecution for heresy and a lot of charges of diabolism, which is also known as like devilish or atrociously wicked conduct. Really hard to say how many people actually died during this period, but rough estimates are anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000, not including those who were lynched, those who committed suicide, or those who died in prison. An estimated 4/5 of those executed were women. Given that the movies I am referencing mostly focus on women as witches, I'll kind of be referring to them in that way as well. And since witches not only sinned against the church, but destroyed property and according to them, murdered people. Witch trials were a matter for both civil and ecclesiastical courts. So because accusations and trials of witches took place in these different courtrooms, the law played a really big role in witchcraft as well as religion. So why women? One of the major texts cited when we talk about the witch hunts is the Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of Witches, which was published in 1486 and written by clergyman Henrik Kramer. This became the essential guide for witch hunting. It gave details on how to spot witches, how to question them, and also how to execute them. And I have a couple of quotes here that I think specifically pertain to why women were the root of evil in their words. But when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. And then even when there are male witches, it is due to female evil, as the other quote states above. Weak in body and mind, spurred on by insatiable, licentious drives, women were thought to make easy prey for the devil. So, just being in their idea, the weaker sex, women were more susceptible to these evils of the devil. They believed that they made pacts with the devil, made ointments out of blood or bodies of children in order to fly, attended witches' sabbaths, dancing naked in the moonlight with other witches, had sex with demons, and in some stories, even stole penises and kept them as pets. The other text quoted here is from much later on from Carol F. Carlson, who explores the Salem witch trials, but her sentiment I think is really interesting when we talk about the history of witch hunts in general. Witchcraft confronts us with ideas about women, with fears about women, with the places of women in society, and with women themselves. It confronts us with the systematic violence against women. So moving on, kind of who were these witches? There is a quote I have here from the book Women's Madness, Misogyny, or Mental Illness by Jane Usher, which asserts that by the 20th century, asylums and mental health treatment had become the new witch hunts of the time in terms of controlling women that did not conform to societal values, or to those who, a lot of people talk about how this was an opportune moment for men to simply get rid of women who were troublesome in their life, women that were having affairs with, children, potentially even wives. So similarly, the witch hunts and asylums kind of used in that way to just simply get rid of women who were not conforming at the time. There is a common narrative, which is, I think pertains to this quote here, but in general, in a lot of like feminist texts that believe that witches were powerful women in communities, and that is why they were potentially hunted down. Well, I think this is definitely something that is interesting, and to think of women as like being healers and midwives and holding these positions of power, and that making them really the fruit to be plucked for the witch trials. Really, it came down to any woman could potentially be executed. Any woman could potentially be tried as a witch. Moving on here, it also had much to do with political and social climates of the time. The most common suspicions concerned livestock, crops, storms, disease, property, inheritance, sexual dysfunction, rivalries and feuds between families, marital discord, and also just like local politics of the time. So really, whenever you see this community strife going on, oftentimes witches became the perfect scapegoat to blame for said strife. Often the women who were tried and executed were poor, while the rich and powerful were less likely to be executed. We do still see some cases where more affluent women were accused. While the narrative that powerful women were the ones being targeted it is much more telling of human history in general that any woman was at risk of being accused, tried, or executed. Because of the sheer magnitude of accusations, any sort of misstep, anything that got women noticed could put them in the line of fire. I really love this quote here from the book In Defense of Witches, which came out earlier this year. Every behavior and its opposite could be used against you. It was suspicious to miss Sunday Mass too frequently, but it was also suspicious to never miss it. It was suspicious to gather regularly with friends, but also to have too solitary a lifestyle. There was not necessarily a right way to act. Simply existing as a woman put you in danger, something that I am sure many women can still relate to in a variety of cultural issues, especially coming up in the United States where I am. Now, punishment for witches really varied depending on the countries and time periods. Typical things witch hunters were looking for were physical signs, the witch's mark, usually some sort of mole that they thought was essentially another nipple that devils or demons would suck from, and would also check for different spots where women were numb to pain, seeing that as a sign that they were potentially witches as well. There are a variety of torture devices used: iron collars, stretching racks, logging, binding, thumb screws, whips, you name it, there's tons of them. While they were looking for confessions of witchcraft or diabolism, they were also looking for witches to give up names of other witches in the community. They did not believe that witches were working alone, so it was essential that they also named names while they were being tortured, which is why we see so many people being tried and potentially executed during this time period. One of the tests here for witchcraft I have depicted is the witch swimming test. So if she drowned, she was innocent, and if she floated, she was a witch, and therefore she would be executed. But either way, she would die in the process of this test. As far as executions, early 12th century burnings were adopted for the execution of heretics. Unless guilty of murdering their husbands or attempting the murder of a reigning monarch, English witches were hanged as common criminals, which also kind of comes over when the Salem witch trials take place later on. I grew up in Massachusetts. I frequently visited Salem for Halloween, so I was always very interested in the Salem witch trials from a very young age, but much more of a smaller scale than when we talk about the European witch hunts. So this took place from 1692 to 1693. There are some distinct differences. The sexual elements of the European witch hunts did not carry over to Salem, so we don't really see the discussions of devil's penises or sex with demons, anything like that, because it was a puritanical society. They did not sensationalize any of this and really downplayed those sexual elements. But considering the amount of American films made that discuss witches, this is also still an important period to talk about. And a really good example of how political strife exacerbated existing problems that were in the community. So Puritans blamed many problems that happened to them on the devil, church politics, family feuds, and this really spurred on this period of mass hysteria. which started in January of 1692 when Reverend Paris, his daughter Elizabeth, niece Abigail, and another girl were found screaming, throwing things, uttering weird noises and sounds, and having this like these hysterical episodes. When they were pressured into explaining what happened by political leaders at the time, the girls blamed 3 witches for afflicting them. Tituba, Paris's Caribbean slave, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, impoverished woman. So when we talk about witches as women being on the outskirts of society, this is really when we kind of see this happening. These women that were not considered to be, upstanding women of their society and community at the time. So women who were poor, who were homeless, who were slaves, were the first ones to be executed. And then this really became the catalyst for a stream of accusations that occurred. About 200 people were accused, 19 people were actually executed. Also, where we see specific details about how at least this core group of women were kind of outcasts of the society. The lore of the time dictated that these witches signed their name in the devil's book and therefore agreed to do his bidding and destroy the Puritans, as they said. But I think that's just kind of an interesting element because that will come up in some of the films that we talk about a little bit later. So yes, after, eventually we see these witch hunts die down, but the term witch hunt itself has really been co-opted by a variety of groups throughout history. Now, one of the definitions for a witch hunt is a campaign directed against a person or group holding unorthodox or unpopular opinions. When I did just a general Google search for news about witch hunts, all of the first things that popped up were former President Donald Trump referring to witch hunts that were occurring against him. So we can see how people really have co-opted this in a variety of ways. Although it is interesting to look on specific parts of our history, at least US history, like McCarthyism from the 1950s, where a lot of people were blacklisted, lost their jobs because they were supposedly a part of the Communist Party at the time. So kind of seeing how these witch hunts were transferred into other societal issues of the time. In the book Women's Madness, there are direct correlations between treatment of women during the witch hunts and the psychiatric care and treatment, like I had mentioned earlier. Hysterical or ill women really became a label used later on in the 1800s and 1900s in the United States for a variety of reasons. And we also see women being thrown into asylums as well as having to face things like the rest cure, hydrotherapy, or electroshock therapy is just a few examples. The real way witch hunts looked at a mass movement of hatred against women has continued in a variety of ways as well, especially right now. It's been interesting to do this research while, in the United States, Roe versus Wade is potentially going to not be in effect anymore, meaning that tons of people who have uteruses would not have access to abortions. So thinking more about how we can continuously target women and people in general in these different ways. So kind of getting into the films now, I want to talk about witch archetypes in film. Witches are used in a variety of ways. Early witch archetypes we see are things like the accused woman narrative, so a woman who is accused and potentially going through a trial, usually like more historical based films. Elderly folk witches, fantasy witches like the Wicked Witch of the West, who terrified me as a child. And then in the 1980s, we really get to see a lot of the satanic panic influence on witches in film. So we see a lot of satanic witches who were really hypersexualized, independent, and aggressive. Not necessarily great portrayals of them, but interesting to see this like hypersexualized version of the witch coming more into film around that time. Which the quote here is that witch films began to reflect the panic, moving witches into a new place of empowerment and legitimacy, if only negative in nature. So also seeing how this narrative about witches changes as well. Given the amount of imagination that went into making up the supposed crimes of the witches, it is not surprising that many artists, writers, films found ripe inspiration with the witch trials. There's a great book called Satanic Feminism that talks a little bit about the witch archetype as one of empowerment for a variety of groups, especially during like the Romantic period. We see in general witches, but also the devil specifically as more of an empowering factor, because if God was the person that was responsible for much of the persecution that was going on at the time, then the devil is the opposite, and he's really this representation of liberation for people, and therefore witches being kind of these these people working with the devil also kind of extend with that empowerment aspect as well. So then we really get to like reclaiming the witch. The witch really has been an interesting symbol in general in feminist movements. This quote here is also from the book In Defense of Witches. By reclaiming the story of the women accused of witchcraft, Western feminists have, whether deliberately or not, both perpetuated their subversive effect and definitively reasserted the terrifying power accorded with them by the judge. So it is this kind of idea of, if you're going to label me as a witch, if you're going to give me these negative connotations, then just I will have to show you how powerful this witch is. And I picked just some of these symbols that we see here, like the witch movements, using this for a lot of like social reform. This imagery of like the witch who is smoking a cigarette while being burned at the stake, kind of like not affected at all by what's happening. And then this quote that I feel like has been coming around for like the past couple years: "We are the granddaughters of the witches you could not burn." So just seeing how this has become a really big part of feminist culture in general. So the specific kind of subsects of witches I'll be talking about are twofold here. I think that there's a lot of films that use the witch as kind of a poorly researched plot device, as opposed to giving the witch like autonomy and personality. And some of these films might fall into that trope as well, but I think in general have some interesting things to say. There are other films that I'll reference that are outside the scope of this as well, but I think bring some interesting conversation in general to gender politics and inclusivity with the witch narrative. Too many of these stories, of course, focus on, cisgendered straight women, which I'll talk a little bit more about in general as we get through the presentation. But the first type of witch typically that we see starting in like film narratives that I think is kind of this tool of patriarchal disruption is a witch who we don't necessarily see her transformation into a witch. She just simply is this monstrous presence anyway, but specifically uses her power and to go after systems that historically oppress women. Sometimes it might just be a single man or a group of men, but also them representing specific structures like the church, organized religion in general, but like mostly Christianity, and other type of like misogynistic men, governments who are also imposing against women, and just societal values of the time that were meant to just put women down. The second is one that I feel like we see a lot more in narratives now, which is a woman who, because of life circumstances, chooses witchcraft to liberate herself. Oftentimes, these witches are more of a moral gray area, less villain or hero, kind of like black and white, having those binaries, and much more just in this about getting power, getting autonomy over herself. Women who, given the opportunity, choose witchcraft as a way to liberate themselves from these systems of oppression. So I have these two examples here. The first from the film Vi, who I think really represents the first example of witchcraft, kind of tearing down a man that's representative of the church. And then Robert Eggers' The Witch, and showing Thompson, who we'll talk a little bit more in detail about. I do really like how none of them really fit into these solely good or bad categories either for the second part of the talk, but I'm excited to see what other people think about that as well. The first film I want to reference is Haxan, just because I think it is really interesting and really adds to some of the historical context of the time and is just a striking film. So this really highlights the way that women were persecuted, tortured, and tricked into confessing, as well as making connections to the witch trials and hysteria of the 1920s. Its connection also to men and how they would blame their own sexual arousal on women, as well as the abuse and manipulation that was used against these women. There's a great scene where a man is overcome with desire for a woman, and he has to repent, but really she is to blame because she has put this spell on him, and that's what has made him so sexually attracted to her, and therefore she needs to be punished, which is just an interesting narrative with this particular film. The next film, Il Demonio from Italy, is a really great one. It follows Purif, who's a lonely peasant woman who's obsessed with her former lover, Antonio, who's about to be married to another woman. She makes several attempts to win him over and eventually ends up saying that she will curse him. Her family attempts to save her soul and bring her to different religious men who can cure her. But more and more, the town sees her as a witch and become really upset with Purif and her antics that go on throughout the film, and label her as a witch and try to drive her out of the town or execute her. She's someone who represents things that the town rail against, and therefore she must be punished. She is portrayed as a wild, uninhibited sexual woman whose lust for a married man is something that the society and community just rail against completely. It also is shown in several different ways in the film that she potentially does actually have magical powers. She's able to boy who's about to die. He's on his deathbed. It seems like she does successfully curse Antonio, the lover who spurred her. So there are also interesting ways in which we see Purif showing her power, but the town itself still kind of railing against that power that she holds. Also, because she is this sexual woman, most of the people in the town really dislike that aspect of her, and that's part of the reason that she is driven out. But we also constantly see Purif being someone who is abused by men in the film. She's bound and raped by a sheep herder. The man that her family brings her to that's supposed to cleanse her also takes advantage of her in that situation. So all of these good folks, all of these good men in the town are actually people who end up abusing her and using the fact that she's already seen as this like vile person in the community as a way to get their sexual desires met. Even in the end of the film, Antonio decides to kill her, but not before sleeping with her. So we see how she's constantly abused and used while also being seen as this like viper. The next film is one that I think I just found a really good copy on YouTube. It was really great. The storytelling is a little hard at times, but it stars Barbara Steele, who's such a great seductive presence, especially as she's playing this witch character. It takes place during the 15th century, and it opens with an accused witch being burned at the stake. Her death seems to help several powerful men in the town. One, it helps the count, who has sexual desires for this woman, and because now she is about to be executed, that just immediately takes her off the plate. And then also the count's son, Kurt, who was able to frame this witch for a murder that he in fact committed. So we see how the witch hunts are used as a tool by powerful men to get rid of women or to get rid of the blame for crimes that they in fact committed. It just highlights again how male sexual desires are tied to the witch trials and how easy it is for these powerful men to cover up their own crimes under the pretense of witchcraft. Years later, the daughters of this witch who was executed are able to infiltrate the home of these powerful men. One marries Kurt, and the other shows up on the doorstep and is able to seduce him. Both use their sexuality as a tool to help in their plot for revenge. While their vendetta is personal, they're able to show how little these men do care about the townspeople or the fact that they have this position of power. These men bring death and destruction and plague to the village. They are selfish and ill-equipped to deal with actual threats that come into the village. And ultimately, we see Kurt as one of the main villains of this film. He is constantly manipulating people, using these women for sexual gratification, and is really culpable for most of what's wrong that's going on in the film. Ultimately, the film has a very Wicker Man-like ending. The two women team up and are able to stuff Kurt into a totem that the villagers burn in order to ward off witchcraft and plague. So it also has a very fitting end for Kurt, who does get punished very similarly to the witch at the beginning of the film. And then we get to Vi, which another really beautiful film that I love. Panochka is a witch who changes her appearance. We see her first as like an ugly, aging crone, and then we see her as the young fair maiden. And what happens is a seminary student, Koma, comes upon her after a night of drinking with a friend. She appears to him as the old woman, tries to seduce him, and when he pushes her away and like rejects her sexual advances, she uses him like a horse and rides him around. The two of them struggle. He eventually accidentally kills her, and when she dies, she's transformed into a beautiful maiden. Koma tries to cover up his crimes and tries to just hide the fact that he was a part of murdering this young woman. But unfortunately for him, he is asked to see over the death rites of her body and has to spend 3 nights alone with her body, each night seeing her come back to life and confronting him with the crimes that he has committed. It's part ghost story, part witch story. It also has some really interesting folklore roots from the time. We don't really get to see witches riding men around for fun, but there are some really great images of it that you can find. When Kurt is brought to her, he is also said, they tell him that he will get rewarded by seeing over the body. He'll also get all of this money if he spends all 3 nights with the body. So he is also very much a greedy man, even though he is this man that is supposed to be representative of this religion, and he wants to get this money. He's also portrayed as a drunk, very hypocritical, doesn't really seem to care about religion itself, mostly seems like a place where he's able to just study and have a roof over his head. His refusal to admit his wrongdoing while hiding behind the Bible is ultimately his undoing. Panochka is represented as an enemy of men who abuse their power, who murder women, as well as an enemy of the church, which can often be hypocritical in what they preach versus what they do. And then one of my favorites in this context to talk about is George Romero's Season of the Witch from 1972, which just really stands out as far as films from the time. Most 70s and 80s film fall into that satanic witch trope that I mentioned, these hypersexualized witches. Because of this, I personally didn't find many films that I thought really pertained to this topic from that time period. But Romero has always been good at embedding his films with really ripe social commentary. And that's exactly what he does with Season of the Witch, making connections between witchcraft and the New Age movement, as well as the second wave of feminism. However, because they wanted this film to sell at the time, they advertised it as a softcore porn under the name Hungry Wives, which unfortunately, this is, for those who are interested, not very pornographic in any sort of way. Joan is a lonely housewife. Her husband is away. When he is around, we see him potentially being abusive to her. She has a very strained relationship with her daughter, who is in college at the time. She has a few friends, but besides that, she doesn't really have much of a social life and is ultimately a pretty solitary person. And it does not appear to be someone that is fulfilled by the life that they are currently leading. And it seems like much of her true desires she is not able to pursue. She's introduced just kind of like randomly at a party to witchcraft and finds the ways that it can potentially empower her, mostly using it for sexual liberation, and using witchcraft to seduce a man that she is interested in. Inevitably, she uses her powers to free herself from the societal norms and bonds of the time, eventually her marriage when her husband dies. In regards to witchcraft, the quote at the top is from one of the characters in the film that I think is really interesting, but describes it as the religion offers further a retreat for emotional women, repressed women, masculine women, and those suffering from personal disappointment or nervous maladjustment. So really bringing back that idea that witchcraft is a way for those who have potentially been outcasts by society in some sort of way to find empowerment and community. There's another interesting quote here from Heather Green, the author of Lights, Camera, Witchcraft, which is a really great study on witchcraft in film and television in America. She says that the film itself is more a dramatic study on female agency and gender negotiations in modern suburbia. Joan goes from the point of powerlessness to a point of power through sexual liberation and witchcraft. Romero's low-budget witch film provides a unique construction of witchcraft and witches that is not replicated again for nearly a decade and beyond. So like I said, this really is a film that stands out at the time and one that we don't really see anything similar for some years to come. Another really great one to reference here is Belladonna of Sadness. I often think of this more as like a rape revenge film, but the witchcraft elements of it are really interesting to point out, especially in this context. After a peasant woman is raped on her wedding night by a baron and his underlings, she is propositioned by the devil, who offers her help to obtain power. She agrees, and she and her husband slowly become more powerful and rich members of the community that they are in. The locals begin to respect her and her husband. However, the Baron sees that they are gaining this power, and he and his wife persist in trying to put them down. The Baroness accuses her of being a witch, and they descend upon her. Her husband, Jean, does not really do anything to try to defend his wife in any meaningful way, and she is eventually driven out of the town. So after she is driven out of the town, she decides she really wants to just take revenge on the world itself, and gets full power from the devil in order to get the revenge that she desires. So seeing her kind of begin as this lowly peasant who is someone that is able to very easily be manipulated and used by powerful members of the community, to eventually becoming this powerful witch and this representative of like feminist empowerment in some way. Although we can see in this picture here, she eventually does get burned at the stake. The film itself makes an interesting connection to her spirit living on and going on to be the spirit and driving force behind cultural and revolutions like the French Revolution. So it also really makes ties to peasants and poverty uprising against the bourgeoisie class. It has a lot of strong ties to Sylvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, which also talks about capitalism's tie in general to witchcraft. So while I think it has those empowerment elements, it's also interesting to look at in that context as well. This is a film that I was also able to find on YouTube, which sounded really interesting. It maybe wasn't the best film, but has a lot of interesting narrative pieces that I think are important to talk about in the context of this talk. So this is a film called The Devonsville Terror from 1983. It is about a town, much like Salem, that decides to pursue and hunt some of the women in the town and accuse them of witchcraft. They kill 3 women in the town and are cursed. 300 years later, 3 liberated, assertive women move into the town, and all of a sudden this history begins to repeat itself, and we see how women start to be persecuted in different ways. One of the women is a school teacher named Jenny, who is immediately someone they see as trouble because she tells children that in Babylonian times, God was considered a woman, immediately making her an outcast in the society. The other one is a woman named Chris, who's an environmental scientist who finds that the town has been polluting the water supply. And then there's Monica, a radio disc jockey, who's another kind of empowered woman who is giving relationship advice to other women, telling them to leave their husbands, abusive relationships, things like that. Their presence angers the town. A lot of the bigoted patriarchs, including Walter Gibbs, a middle-aged store owner who has just recently murdered his sick wife. As these men both persecute while also sexually pursuing these women, eventually the town becomes enraged and they decide to go after these women just like they did in the witch trials. However, this time around, the town itself is punished for its misgivings. Again, not a great film, but really interesting in this context, especially showing how history tends to repeat itself in different ways. The next one is one I didn't necessarily think I would talk about, even though I'm a huge Stuart Gordon fan, but this is a film called The Pit and the Pendulum, another adaptation of Poe's story, which doesn't actually have a lot to do with Poe's story, but it begins as an accused women's story, to a woman being empowered and using witchcraft. Maria is accused of being a witch because she speaks out against the use of public torture and executions that the church is behind. The Grand Inquisitor tells her that she is a witch. He throws her into in a dungeon, and she is tortured repeatedly by him and many of the other powerful members of the town. The Grand Inquisitor also lusts after Maria and makes several attempts to be with her. Every time he does, he eventually blames her, accusing her of using witchcraft, and that is the reason he is lusting after her. So again, this use of blaming women's sexuality when really it's the men that are problematic here. She finds kinship in the dungeon. She meets an older woman named Esmeralda, who tells her that she has these inherent magical powers that she can use, and eventually she does use them to help herself and other people of the town, as well as punishing these very sadistic, corrupt men that hold leadership roles in town. The next one is The Craft, one that I think has really interesting elements, but also has maybe some problems, I guess, in the context of like female empowerment. But I wanted to discuss this because it is like a classic and there are a lot of great elements of it. The women that are witches in this film are women who are outcasts in some way, and they utilize witchcraft as a way to punish their bullies, punish racists, as well as like other people who hurt or attack them. So it is this story about witches. It also has more of a story about sisterhood and community as opposed to these solitary witch narratives that I think we often see in these films. Nancy is like this, she's poor, she's goth, she looks different, so she's picked on. There's Bonnie, who has scars on her body that make her really self-conscious and withdraw from others. And then there's Rochelle, who unfortunately, really the only reason she is an outcast is because she's Black, and she is constantly exposed to racism from her classmates. There's a really great blog called Graveyard Shift Sisters that talks about Rochelle's identity in this film. Rochelle's score to settle was not explored and displayed enough with the emotional weight it carried. It was played as superficial comeuppance for Laurie's racial intolerance. So there are some problems with this film, although I think it does have some interesting elements, specifically when talking about outcasts finding empowerment. However, ultimately, most of these outcasts are either lose their powers, they all sort of gang up on each other. Most of them become bullies themselves, and eventually that sisterhood is broken. So although the ending doesn't necessarily hold up in this context, it does put a lot of these great ideas forth. And then we get to Eggers the Witch, which, is one of my favorites. I love this movie. I have this quote here that witchcraft is a chosen path of empowerment for society's victims, specifically women. It is a tool of the oppressed, demonstrating that one woman's transgression is another woman's livelihood. In doing so, they challenge the structure that have long defined our understanding of our history, society, and conventional morality. And this is specifically in reference to the witch, as well as the love witch, which I'll be talking about afterwards. Um, so in this film, Thompson is a girl who is on the cusp of womanhood in a puritanical society. Because of her father's religious beliefs, the whole family has to leave their community and are isolated in the wilderness of New England. And unfortunately for them, there is a witch in the woods that causes a lot of havoc on the family itself. But for Thompson, it's a little bit different. For Thompson living in the home she's currently in, she's simply one more mouth to feed. And her family would rather her be married off to another family so they don't have to worry about her anymore. She's also a second woman in the household, which simply can't exist. We see that the mother is very jealous of Thompson and the effect that she has on both the husband and brother in the family. So we also see the mother and daughter's relationship become strained because of this like jealousy that's happening. Things become worse for Thompson when she is blamed for the disappearance of her sibling, and she's ultimately accused of witchcraft. And so it gets to a point where if she's going to be accused of these crimes, if she's going to be accused for doing all of these things, then like might as well actually just become a witch and get away from the puritanical households that is causing so much trouble for her. We see the devil as an ally in this film who helps her get rid of her troublesome family and offers her the luxuries and life her parents would not allow for her. She ultimately makes the choice that gives her the most power and agency in this situation. I know I often talk about this film and try to talk about whether this is like a good for her film. I think in the context of the storytelling, I think this is mostly because she chooses the path that is simply giving her the most agency at the time, when there aren't many other options offered to her in the moment. After she makes the choice and joins the witches and levitates in the woods under the full moon, it feels like the first time she has some acceptance within a community, as well as power beyond her wildest dreams. Through that act of becoming a witch, she saves herself and is resurrected an empowered woman in an ironic shot similar to an image of a rising Christ figure, which I think really ties into those ideas of satanic feminism. So yes, these ideas of puritanical beliefs, isolation, these ideas of like the family being devastated by being in this environment they don't understand, really seems to just be a microcosm for a lot of the witch trials that occurred, at least in New England. But I really love, I especially love the ending of this film, and this image in particular, I think is really important in this context. And then we get to The Love Witch. So female directed horror film, great. I love this one. She has this quote, Elaine, witchcraft saved my life. There's a lot of good humor in this film, humor that I feel like I didn't really pick up on until I watched it a second and third time. But we see Elaine as this, at least she thinks, this empowered woman when we are introduced to her. She's beautiful, she has all this power, but then we also see how she is still a victim in a male-dominated society. We constantly get flashbacks of her husband making fun of her, telling her she isn't like that good of a wife, making fun of her appearance and the way she acts. And then all of the men that populate this film are schmucks, especially the ones that she is going after and pursuing. We see her constantly use her witchcraft to pursue these mediocre men. we know that she has been abused, especially emotionally, in a variety of ways. It also seems like she has a tumultuous relationship with the man that initiated her into witchcraft, which also feels like maybe he abused his power in that context of being the leader of their coven. But she uses witchcraft to be beautiful, attractive to men, to get attention. But we also see that these are not necessarily men who would want to give her attention, at least the attention she wants under normal circumstances. They're not necessarily available men who would fall in love with her in this way. But ultimately, in the ending, we see this change that happens within her, especially with this quote here, where she says, that means I get to take what I need from men and not the other way around, which in the story itself feels like an empowered moment for her, that kind of goes against how we've seen her act up to this point. And then the 2018 Suspiria film, which I know caused a lot of issues with people that love the original. I too love the original, but I think under this context, this actually has a lot more interesting story elements than the initial one. Specifically, this idea of killing the old masters and starting anew. When we see Susie go to this school, we're introduced to the school that is run by a coven of witches. They're often witches who are arguing over who should be the next leader. And the majority of them continuously vote for Helena Marcos, even though it doesn't seem like she is potentially a meaningful leader or someone that's going to bring in potential change. So I think there's a lot of interesting political elements to the story in that way. So as Susie, comes more and more into her power, comes more into what's happening within the school, she seems to notice that those that are being used and abused are these students. So this isn't necessarily a safe space for these young girls. It's really this space where the witches of the coven are given, all of these fruitful, beautiful women that they can use in their witchcraft and as potential sacrifices to the most powerful women in the coven. The film itself is mostly populated by women, which I find really interesting, and is a damnation of men in positions of power. We see the witches of the coven exercise their power over many men of authority, specifically police officers, as well as Dr. Klemperer, who they specifically confront him with the fact that all of these girls have come to him saying that they believe something bad's going on in the school, and he simply tells them they have delusions. And so he's also an enemy, even though these witches have been actually murdering and going after these girls. We see this idea of the coven kind of becoming perverted in its beliefs and really needing some new energy, some new leadership to come in, which is eventually what happens. We see this as a rebirth. New leadership could potentially create a healthier coven in the future. There's no guarantees, but it does have this element of being slightly more uplifting in the fact that change might come in, which would benefit the woman involved. And then, of course, I am she is the quote I used from this talk, which comes from this moment, which I think is so powerful in the film. And then another I wanted to mention very quickly is Gretel and Hansel from Oz Perkins, which has kind of similar themes to Suspiria in the sense of improving upon the generation before us and choosing your own path. Gretel is often offered all of this power by Hulda, the witch, but in order to gain that power, she is told she needs to kill her brother. She does want this power, but she also does not want to kill her brother. Ultimately, they kill Hulda, and she sends her brother off on his own, and she stays in the woods to explore her power and her magic. I like that element of the film a lot. I think it's really interesting. She makes the choice to pick a totally different path, one that is not one of the paths that is offered for her, but one that she can ultimately still follow if she'd like. And then I added the craft legacy in here as well, talking about the original. This is clearly made for a younger generation of horror fans. So there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily work for me, but I think it tries to improve upon a lot of some of the problems that the first one potentially had. We see a lot more representation in this film, including Zoe Luna, who is a transgender actress. We also make room for boys to explore their sexuality. We have one of the bullies in the film is someone we find out is bisexual and bullies because it stems from this pain of trying to conform to something that he's simply not. And the enemy of the film is essentially a coven of dangerous men who are trying to uphold traditional gender roles and take power away from these witchy women. And then Hellbender, which I saw at Final Girls in February and I really loved. This kind of similarly has this tumultuous relationship between like the old order and the new. Izzy comes from this line of Hellbenders who are these witch-like folks that possess a ton of power, but her mother is afraid of her utilizing that power and therefore tries to suppress it in a variety of ways, including keeping her completely isolated from other people. As Izzy comes into her own and begins to explore her power more and more, she decides she wants to pick a completely different path, which unfortunately for her mother means that she is going to, fully come into her power and potentially become this dangerous presence that the mother was worried about in the first place. And then I think the last main one I wanted to bring up was You Won't Be Alone, a film that I really loved from this year. Similar in its own forging your own path story, which I think is just kind of a trend that I'm seeing now in these witch narratives. A woman or a young girl is forced to live in a cave because her mother is worried that this witch is going to come after her daughter. She feels restless, upset that she's growing up alone and solitary this way. And so then still makes the choice to join up with the witch and gain this magical power. And then realizes that if she wants to be exactly like this witch, it also means she has to live this solitary lifestyle, which she simply does not want to. So she decides to use the power she is given to shapeshift and go into a variety of communities, learn what it's like to live from a variety of perspectives, and really try to not be alone, which I think ultimately is one of the aspects of the film that is really beautiful. So those are the main films that I really wanted to talk about. I have a few that I wrote here that I think are really interesting narratively that didn't really, I think, fit into the context of this particular talk. I Am Not a Witch is really great and really makes a lot of interesting connections between how witches are something in this community that are both, hated and railed on, but they're also used as a way for them to make money. Tourists love to see these witches, so it really has those like capitalist ties. Valerie and Her Week of Wonders is much more of an adult fairy tale, but I think dips a lot into witch territory. Has one of like the most like memeable parts of the film that we always see, where she is like making fun of these people who are about to execute her. The Old Ways as well is a film that is much more about possession and addiction, but it also has this interesting central story about a woman who is going back to her homeland and picking up the mantle of the old ways, becoming a bruja and deciding to like stay back home, like in the culture that she is from. And then Lux Eternia, which I saw a few weeks ago in New York, which draws a lot of comparisons to the witch trials and how women are treated in the film industry. I think that's coming out on VOD soon, so definitely keep an eye out for that because I thought it was great. And then simply kind of like looking to the future. Ultimately, like I said, a lot of these films are focused on like white cisgendered women. So I am interested to see how this genre and potentially this scope will eventually become more inclusive. Seeing more BIPOC, LGBTQ, disabled, sexual witches. I think this is a trend we're seeing in a lot of television and books. I think there's like a lot of YA that really delves into being more inclusive in a variety of ways, but we really just haven't seen it kind of like transferred to the big screen yet. Also just seeing more inclusivity behind the camera and potentially moving from these solitary witch stories to stories that are more about community as well. So yeah, that is my talk. Thanks so much for listening. And yeah, please stay in touch if you're interested.
Wow, thank you so much, Tori. That was super fascinating. Um, I think everyone here is very excited to check out a lot of these films and happy to have your readings of them as well in informing their viewings. So yeah, everyone, please feel free to send your questions to the chat so we can forward them directly to Tori for the Q&A. You can also raise your hand if you want. There's like a button for that. One question that we just had early on was if you could post a filmography list of the films that you covered in your talk.
Yeah, definitely. Because I know there's a lot of books I reference too. So I was planning on putting one up on my blog after the talk. So I'll try to get that to folks this week if you're interested.
Cool, that would be great. I'll start with a question I have. Are there any particular witch stories in, for example, in literature or art or mythology or other mediums that you would love to see explored in a film context that you haven't seen explored yet?
That's interesting. Well, I know one thing we were talking about at the beginning of this is that I'd really love to see a Medusa film. I know that's like one thing in general. We're like thinking about more like empowerment and also like recontextualizing stories. I think I'm like shocked that Medusa isn't something we haven't covered more, especially since I think in mythology that's like been a trend in like a lot of fiction, like with Circe, and there's a book on Ariadne, as well as I think the Trojan Wars, and the women that were in the Trojan Wars. So I think like seeing some of those myths like come to the big screen would be really cool and interesting. Um, I also think like, especially in the US, we have like a really interesting history, especially when we talk about New Orleans with like more like Black witchcraft and brujas and things like that. And I feel like while I found some examples of those things, I didn't see a ton of them. And so I feel like I'd love to see some more inclusion that way, because I still think a lot of what we've seen represented in films is like much more based in like westernized history and folklore and mythology.
Like there's a bit of coverage of the New Orleans voodoo tradition in like American Horror Story. I can't remember which season, and it's a bit
Yeah,
hard in my head, but I'm remembering some cool.
And also like Eve's Bayou, right?
Eve's Bayou is a great one.
oh yeah, Eve's Bayou is really great. Yeah.
Ali, you had a
Yeah,
question,
I have a
right?
question. Could you talk a bit more about the like disruptive power of the decrepit older witch, like the Wicked Witch of the East, the West?
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, I feel like I didn't necessarily talk about I guess like these older destructive witches mostly. I didn't necessarily see how they fit into this kind of context, but I do find one, I would like, that's another area I'd like to see more in, just like focusing on these like older witches that hold all this power. But yeah, I think, thinking about even just how the Wicked Witch has been recontextualized. I was thinking about how, I grew up when I was like 13, I got to see Wicked on Broadway with my family, and that was like, I didn't know that was a thing you could do, where you could like take this like villainous character that was portrayed like when I was a child that I was terrified of, and recontextualize her in a way where she is this really empathetic, interesting, like understanding, a character that you like understand her motives much more. And so I feel like I'd love to see that for these like older crones as well. I think in general that's like another trend that we're seeing much more of too. I know another thing we were talking about before this was just like kind of dealing with like getting old and aging and Alzheimer's and things like that in horror. So I feel like hopefully the crone witch will have her moment in horror too, and see more of those stories on the big screen.
A few questions now from the crowd. Natalia Bertova asks, "What sets apart a witch and a person with powers, like Carrie or Eleven in Stranger Things?"
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like it's a really gray area for sure. I think when I was thinking about the context of this, it was specifically a lot of like they specifically used the word witch. And I think potentially there is more of like a I don't want to say like structure, but there is like, the use of spells and the use of like, crafting in a way, and like that we see with like exploration of witchcraft that we might not necessarily see with people that like just kind of hold power. But yeah, I feel like there probably is much more of a gray area than we would think with a lot of that. I think a lot of stories, when I was researching this too, I watched a lot of films that I noticed a lot of like witch lore was really melded with like vampire lore. So there seemed even to be a lot of gray area between like stories that were about witches and stories that were about vampires. Like Bava's film Black Sunday, there's like a lot of like talk about witchcraft, but also a lot of like nuances as far as like things we think about more when we talk about vampires. So I do think there's a pretty big gray area there, and I don't necessarily know. There probably isn't as much of a distinction as we probably think.
Another question. Milmy Yates asks, while I enjoy the use of magic in cinema as a metaphor for female empowerment, it often feels I often feel conflicted about the depiction of magic as real or evil in the content that historically women in the witch trials really did lose their lives for no reason at all. How do you feel about this contradiction, and how do you navigate it as a feminist film viewer?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it is hard, especially as like someone who comes from more of a historical background, because we do, when we look at this now, we do look at them as like these were simply victims. These are people that like did not ask to be treated this way in any sort of context, and many people lost their lives. And I think it's hard too, because I think not even just with this, but a lot of history. I worked at like a historic prison for a really long time, and so there's a lot of people that still make fun of, or use like certain like language when we talk about like people who are in prison. Similarly, like with witchcraft too. I think it's hard too, because now we have so many people that like identify as witches, whether people that are like actually like doing spell work, feel like they're part of covens and communities in that way, or using it more as a term to simply empower themselves and maybe not have some of that, I guess more of those like traditional elements attached to it too. I mean, I think in general, like especially with horror, I just love that we're able to explore so much gray area, so much trauma, so many like bad things that have happened in a variety of contexts and things that happen like every day. So I think for me, it's interesting to see how we have used the witch, at least in the context of some of these films, to be more about empowerment and about people finding their inherent power in different ways. But yeah, I think it's fair to also still be conflicted in that area too. And there are definitely like certain narratives that I have felt conflicted on too.
Yeah, thank you. This is, I think that's a really important conversation. Another question I was having while watching your talk was if you can recommend some more witch tales that don't like emerge from oppression, or like where the starting place isn't abuse or oppression, and this kind of like marginalization. Like, is it possible to have a witch tale that doesn't stem from that, or is the witch contingent upon that history?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I feel like isn't rooted in oppression. um, but yeah, I feel, and who knows, someone could make a really great narrative that isn't based in oppression, that I'd be like, oh, cool, like this is it, this is the thing. But I feel like, at least from what I've seen, that does seem to be an intrinsic part of these kinds of stories about finding power in this way, which is unfortunate. But but yeah, I mean that's also the beauty of horror as it's evolving too, is that maybe we'll see some more of those stories that aren't based in oppression. And if I think of any, I will definitely let you know, because there's possibly some that I know of that I'm just like not able to think of at the moment.
There's a nice comment from Nomi, just the witches, which is funny because I wouldn't say that that's a feminist film in which you root for the
Mm,
witches in the film, but you also don't need to root for them, right? They can also just be villains who are rotten and don't have anything
yeah,
redeeming about them. Like,
which I love that. I in general, I love an irredeemable woman like in
you know the
film.
film I'm referring to, the one that's based on the Roald doll.
Yeah, which I actually didn't see until I was like older. I know that was like a classic for a lot of people growing up, and I don't think I saw that until I was like maybe in my 20s or something. But yeah, like especially now as I'm getting older and probably just becoming more of an embittered human being, I really love like an irredeemable woman in a movie.
Totally. So yeah, that's one where it's like they're totally aspirational. Someone's.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I can also just think of like some short independent films that maybe we received as submissions or that I saw at other film festivals where it's just like some young women or young non-binary queer folks doing magic, and like it's celebratory and it's an experience of community, and it's like witchcraft is the central organizing principle of the film. And I guess the oppression is just it's off screen,
Mm.
but it's
Yeah,
still
I guess
probably part of the it's still like
yeah.
an inherent part of it, just an unspoken part of it.
Yeah, and like as someone, I grew up with two parents who both like went through like they went to like Latin Academy and like grew up in like heavily like religious like schools and homes, and so that was not a thing they wanted to bring into our household. And so I was always like not really having any connection to like a organized religion. I feel like I was always interested in things like witchcraft, where I felt like, oh, I can just like collect rocks and twigs outside and like make up a spell, and like that just felt like cool and exciting to me. Where it didn't necessarily feel like it had like the rules that organized religion had, at least like in from my perspective.
Yeah, totally. More questions are coming through. Anne John Klein asks, which twist would you personally prefer in a story or a movie about witchcraft? Meaning not in the Lassic, I'm not sure what that means, Lassic satanic, or in any way outcast way. If you understand the question, cool, but I'm not quite sure I understand
Yeah, unfortunately I'm not totally I'm not
Classic,
sure.
classic, she says, not in the classic or satanic way. Which twist would you personally prefer in a story or movie about witchcraft? Versus, what are the different twists you're referring to, Anne? Anyway, in the meantime, I'll ask the next question and then maybe we'll get some clarification. Um, Robert Potenza, that's your dad, I'm guessing.
It is my dad.
Has your research included a look at how witches were appreciated and even honored as healers in history?
Yeah, I mean, for the context of this, not too much. And I think what was hard was looking at specifically what I was looking at based out of these histories of oppression with like the witch hunts in Europe and the witch trials in Salem. And so a lot of it really stemmed from the history of oppression and people that weren't necessarily witches in that context too. But yeah, I mean, it is, I think that's something in history that I would like for us to I guess explore more. I think there's a lot of great texts that talk a little bit more about like the history of like healers and midwives and how they were like revered in cultures too, which I think would also be interesting to see more of. I guess it's hard with horror too, because like there has to be these like horrific elements in ways, but yeah, I hasn't included that too much. But thank you for asking, Robert.
Anne says, I mean, a kind of new twist which would be interesting, not satanic or fringe of society related. Okay, so just maybe are there any new spins on the witch narrative or twists on the witch narrative that you could envision?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones like the "You Are Not Alone," which I really really loved, and is like veers I think in a lot of different ways, but that one I liked mostly because there wasn't this twist of like railing against society or men or like the different like forms of oppression that like we typically see with witches, but it was much more about just like using power to find community and to like find acceptance among people. And I probably just like hit me at the right moment where that like just felt like a really beautiful beautiful narrative to have. And so like that itself I felt like was a very interesting twist in that way. But yeah, I think I would like to see things that do veer away, potentially maybe more from some of these like satanic and like kind of I guess like Christianized narratives too. Just as someone who like that isn't really a huge part of my life, so I think I'd like to see more of that too. And I think maybe that comes to with maybe having some more inclusive stories from looking at like witches from other cultures that aren't necessarily based in these like westernized cultures too.
I agree, and look forward to seeing more of that in future cinema. Are there any last questions? We still have about 10 minutes that we could use for engagement. Someone says the Night Sisters in Star Wars. Garrett Smith. Okay, you can unmute yourself, Garrett, if you'd like to ask a question.
Hi. I can't stop thinking about the question about Carrie and 11 and like what the difference between those characters might be and some of the witches that you talked about. And I was thinking about like those characters are like born with their powers, right? Like they don't choose that identity. That identity is just something that they are like born with, where like witches are either have that identity like forced on them, or because they are outcasts choose, like Thomasine, like choose that identity because it gives them like some kind of power to have that identity or something. I don't know if that I just was sort of, I can't stop thinking about this. I'm like trying to suss out like whether this makes any sense, what I'm saying.
No, that's an interesting point. I know, and now that's something I like want to explore a little bit more. Like, where do we draw the lines between these things? Yeah, whoever mentioned the Night Sisters in Star Wars, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. So, was that you, Garrett?
That was also me.
Yeah, I feel like the Night Sisters are also really cool because essentially like in the Star Wars universe, they are force wielders. They are people that are just like using the force that Jedis use in a totally different way, and that is their like witchcraft, which I find really to be an interesting concept too, where it is like this inherent power that a lot of different beings in the universe have, this like ability to wield the force, which is this like unseeable like force that we have. But like because it's in different cultures, it looks like different things or it's called different things. And so I think the Night Sisters are a really interesting example of that because they're essentially like sorceresses that are just like using the force in the Star Wars universe, which is very cool, but I won't talk about Star Wars more than that.
Thanks. Another question coming from Nomi. I want to know if you think there is something inherently feminine about witchcraft, or if you think that a search for power is something those otherized in society seek out.
Yeah, I think it probably has become inherently feminized just because of the history that it stems from. Like, I think I said it was like 4/5 of the people who were executed in the witch trials were women. So I like culturally, like we've kind of like moved to like seeing witches in this feminine light. But I feel like I would like to see kind of losing that gendered piece of like the witch, and really it being something that like I want to see, like, because I know there are out there, I like know people that are like non-binary witches. I know like male witches, there's like tons of queer witches, and so I think I think we probably just like haven't really seen that too much in our film circles, but I even know that there's like some interesting YA that's been written that's like focused on non-binary witches, and I can't remember the name of the one specifically, but I think we are starting to see some more of those narratives that aren't necessarily based in it being this like feminine thing. And I really want to see what that looks like for horror.
Definitely interesting. I was thinking, ever since witches from the original Roald Dahl came up, I was thinking of like children's films, and like, did you think about including them? Did you think about Hocus Pocus and films like that, or was that just a different? That, do you consider that just a different category that doesn't pertain to your talk necessarily?
I think I probably did think about it that way, but like, you know, yeah, like I loved Hocus Pocus growing up. And I feel like, yeah, I'm like, how could I feel like there are a lot of those witches, especially in like children's stories, that we probably could spin it to the fact that they are like patriarchal disruptors of like some sort of part like of our culture. And there's probably a lot of them I could do that for, but like, I didn't necessarily think of them for this talk. Even like, I didn't even think of The Craft until later on, even though that's like a classic that I've seen, that wasn't one I really thought about considering until like a little bit further on as I was like kind of expanding the scope of this research.
Yes, someone says they disrupt the shit out of that town's Halloween.
They do. Fair enough.
Yeah, I love that film. I was just thinking of another one that I love too, but it just completely left me. Oh well. Okay, Lily Brady asks the question: do you feel that witchcraft as a storytelling device, particularly used in a feminist sense, is prominent enough as a genre that it will remain a staple of horror going forward, or something that we might eventually see less of in horror films over time?
I think probably. I think like a lot of these like, you know, archetypes in horror probably like ebbs and flows. I feel like maybe the witch is on like an uptick right now. You know, similarly like happens with like, you know, vampires and zombies and things like that. I feel like especially with just like the prevalence of like the history of like witchcraft and witches, I think it probably will stick around. I mean, I hope it does, because I think there's still like a lot of interesting narratives that haven't really been told.
I sure hope so. Yeah, I think that it's a super rich figure. I remember the children's film that was super important for me. It was a late 80s version of Hansel and Gretel. I think it was like a made for TV version, and it starred Cloris Leachman as the witch.
Oh, wow. I never knew that she was the witch, but that's like perfect for her.
An amazing witch. And yeah, she goes by the name Griselda. I'm not sure if that's like the original name of the witch in like the fairy tale, but
Yeah.
it's a perfect name for her in that context. And I just feel like it's become like this she's this wonderful metaphor of like dangerous deliciousness, you know, like with the candy, the gingerbread house, and the luring and the temptation and the anyway, it's become like
I gotta see that. That's great.
Yeah, it's an effective one, considering that, I mean, it scared the crap out of me as like a 6-year-old, and I still think of it sometimes.
Yep.
All right, here's another question. I keep wondering about Moena. Does there have to be a magical aspect to a witch wielding power, or can Moena be also characterized as a witch simply for being ostracized, assaulted, and disrespected by the townfolk?
No, I think that's a great part too. You know, I think, yeah, a lot of these like do actually delve into someone who has like explicit powers in some way. But yeah, I think similarly to how like a lot of like feminists and a lot of like people who have like become practicing witches like nowadays, you know, I think like it is like such a big group of people, and I think a lot of them are people that feel like they have been ostracized by different like groups of society or religion or whatever. So I think that probably is something we could see more often, and probably have. There probably are like stories like that I would assume deal with people that are more witches because they are ostracized and not because they hold power. But yeah, I think that's like interesting to explore too.
Yes, I think this will be our last question. We're cutting right up to the last minute. Nomi asks, have you seen Hagazusa or Gwen? because they're both folk horror films, witch films, which I saw this year and I was conflicted by, and would love to discuss. I love Hagazusa, I just wanted to say. I forgot
I
about her.
haven't seen that. What was the second one?
Gwen.
Gwen. No, I haven't seen either of those, but I wrote them down and I'm going to look them up.
Yeah, there's also a female cinematographer who did Hagazusa, and the cinematography is
Oh, cool.
like breathtaking. It's a slow burn, but a very, very effective film. And he says Gwen is British witch horror with Maxine Peake.
Oh,
Very
interesting.
relevant to this chat.
Oh, cool. Well, I appreciate I appreciate the recommendation. And if you want to follow me on Letterboxd, if I find it, I'll watch it and I can let you know what I think.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tori. This was a really fun and engaging talk. Of course, it dealt with trauma as well, so not to say that all of it was fun, but it was absolutely fascinating. And I loved the conversation afterwards. Thank you for being here. Thanks to everyone who came and participated. We now have a half-hour break, but we'll be back at 9 o'clock, and we have our last talk of the night. I'll pull up the title of that talk ever so slowly. It is called Inner Hauntings, Memories, Visions, and Haunted Houses in Women-Led Horror Films. And the presenter will be Kate Robertson, from whom we've had a talk in the past, and it was wonderful. So I can really recommend coming back in a half hour and seeing that. And tomorrow, I will tell you what you will see tomorrow. 5 p.m. is an exploration of the librarian in horror films. I mean, how beautifully niche is that, right? I can't wait to hear about that. 7 p.m. we have a disability and horror panel called Beyond the Freak Show with Ariel Vasca and Rabia Sutabi. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing any names. And at 9 p.m. we have The Monstrous Feminine and Political Abjection from May Santiago, also who's been part of our festival in the past and gave a wonderful talk about queer gaze and authorship. So I can't wait to hear all of these talks. Thank you again, Tori. There's a link in the chat somewhere for our Final Girls PayPal. We're happy to keep these talks for free, and if you like them, then feel free to donate a bit to the festival to keep us going strong in future years. To those of you who are not familiar with our work as a festival, we show horror films that are directed by women and non-binary filmmakers, and we hold our annual festival every February, the first weekend of February in City Kino Wedding in Berlin. We also have a Halloween event every year, which is held there. So if you're in Berlin, come by. We'll try to keep some virtual elements going for you all who are not in Berlin as well. So yes, as you see on the screen, you have all of the contact and social media of Tori, so please follow her work, check out her reviews, check out her podcast, the Killer Bees podcast. I can't wait to listen to that as well. And that is all. I bid you farewell. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.